Picasso used to say that even plagiarism, stealing from others, was better than repeating yourself. And I have the feeling I'm just going to do both. Okay, I'm going to steal from other people and from myself, because I've said these things in a variety of ways before, it feels. But part of that theft is actually kind of got a point, in a way, which is to show that some of the ideas that people discuss now when they talk about war and peace, post-conflict reconstruction, so on and so forth, and that they sometimes convey as quite new ideas, they're actually really old ideas. And I want to talk a little bit about some of that ancient prehistory of contemporary post-conflict reconstruction. And I think it helps to see, to do that, to shift perspective and see those ideas in their historical context. Anyway, let's get closer to some of these ideas. There are, I would say, by way of introduction, we'll do this thing. There are three particular big sets of ideas, and kind of common sense, commonplaces that circulate in our discourse. Right? Three sets of ideas, and they combine with, I'm going to list four kinds of opportunity or rationale. And the ideas and the opportunities combine to have created, slightly overstating it, an era, right, of post-conflict reconstruction. In other words, those ideas, those rationales, opportunities have combined to allow for, lead to, encourage new organizations focused on this that didn't exist 20 years ago, let's say. And in particular, that influence resource flows internationally. Talking at the international level. So what are these ideas and these rationales, opportunities? And the three ideas, one is the ideas that fit in the rubric, the liberal peace thesis. We'll expand on that a bit in time. The second, which I've never quite got my head around, is this thing called the security development nexus. I'm sure you're all very familiar with that. And the third is the partial rediscovery of the state, partial rediscovery of the state, after the kind of heyday of the Washington Consensus. And that rediscovery of the role of the state, oh, actually it's not entirely irrelevant, it's rather relevant, up to a point, right? And it turns on a particular understanding of markets. And it goes back to an understanding that actually there are more market failures, and they are more significant and prevalent than we had perhaps, or than economists had perhaps previously realized. And once you acknowledge the existence and the significance of market failures, you think, well, then you have to have a state to correct for them, but not to do any more than that. That's the kind of general idea. So those ideas swill around together, they combine in different ways to shape projects, policy documents, so on and so forth. But as I said, they combine with these four kinds of rationale and opportunity. The first of which is the idea, some of you may believe this, disagree with it, I don't know, but it's a commonly made claim by quantitatively minded economists that aid, international aid, foreign aid, ODA, to post-conflict societies, so post-conflict aid, is more effective than any other kind of aid. So we all tear our hair out. I haven't got much left, but that's because I've been tearing it out, worrying about aid effectiveness, so on and so forth. And there seems to be this huge relief to many people that post-conflict aid seems to work in some way or other. That's the first. The second is, again, an empirical claim. I think questionable. I'd be interested to hear people here's thoughts about it. The claim that the growth rate of GDP, fast growth rate of GDP per capita, is the single biggest factor that reduces the risk after a war of returning to war. Okay? There's this claim that growth is the single biggest factor that reduces the statistical risk of so-called civil war recidivism, conflict recidivism, return to war. Third, there is a common argument that at the end of a violent conflict, a peace deal is signed, there is a kind of institutional vacuum. Institutions have been kind of emptied out by the sort of horror of conflict and so on and so forth. And that produces an opportunity, a perfect moment for very rapid reform. Okay? And the fourth, the international level, kind of rationale for an opportunity for resource allocation to post-conflict aid is the fear of international public bads. Does people know what I mean by that? Anybody want to? Okay, an international public bad is like this. So you know what a public good is? Something like security, street lighting, whatever. Once it's providing, you can't exclude your neighbour from enjoying the benefits of it or something like that. And therefore, so there's all these free rider incentives. So I am, as an individual, not going to pay to put up the street light in my street, because why should I bear the cost when all my neighbours will enjoy the light and the security of walking home at night in the dark and its lights and so on? So they don't get provided sufficiently unless the state taxes people, uses tax revenue and provides those public goods. International public goods would be international versions of those. A public bad is the opposite. It's something that once it happens, you can't necessarily exclude people from, but it's nasty. And it's the fear in the West particularly that there will be deadly spillovers from local conflicts in low and middle income countries. Okay. Migration, disease, terrible ideas, terrorism, so on and so forth. Okay. So the idea is there are these places around the world, and they're low income and they've got their own internal problems, and we have to help and go and stabilize them, build their states, peace build and so on and so forth, to protect ourselves in the West, myself. So those, you can see how powerfully those things can kind of work together to lead to, you now have, I never work out which way around it is in each organization. In one, in DFID in the World Bank, one of them has something called the Conflict Affected and Fragile States Department, and the other has the Fragile and Conflict Affected States, whatever. And the banks had units, they've gone through different names addressing this and so on and so forth. But a range of organizations that created new departments looking at this, and increases in resource allocation to post-conflict aid. I won't show you the data, but I could discuss that data, that trend in post-conflict aid, and how hard it is actually to update the data for quite interesting reasons. Okay, so we've got more organizational interest in this and the generation of larger resource flows. But in aid of what? So I want to talk a little bit more about what I think pushes behind policies, projects, advice, technical assistance, so on and so forth. And I want to begin doing that by upsetting my new friend here, who's a proper economist and so on and so forth, by telling this story about this rather well-known economist who, I keep telling this story. He gave a keynote speech at a conference in Germany on the role of the private sector in post-conflict reconstruction. And he got very, very agitated and angry. And he said, nobody knows anything about post-conflict reconstruction, war to peace transitions. They just talk a load of waffle. And what we need to do, he said, you lot, you have to, governments and you have to unlearn everything you think you know. And we have to drive the rubbish out. I'm paraphrasing because I don't want to be rude. If I quoted him directly, I couldn't do that to an audience like you that I don't know. But anyway, we have to drive the, replace word, rubbish out by the use of hard science. Okay? And he obviously pervades hard science. Okay? He has the science. What is this hard science? Okay? So we immediately get an idea that post-conflict reconstruction really is about scientific objectivity. Okay? Hard science can come up with the solutions, work out how to sequence policies, how to allocate resources. So the hard science in question involves combining econometrics, right, statistical analysis of large data sets, and so on and so forth, trying to find out, if there are interesting patterns and significant coefficients of correlation between this variable and that, and so on and so forth, mapped onto a set of assumptions that underpin the whole edifice, beautiful edifice, of neoclassical economics. So those assumptions are things like methodological individualism, that the appropriate unit of analysis is the individual, and that not only that, but these individuals are creatures of rational choice, purely and utterly. Okay? And they are optimizing, always optimizing their utility, their profit, so on and so forth. Anyway, we're not doing Economics 101, but that's enough of, that's the basis for this hard science. So we have an idea that maybe post-conflict reconstruction, policies for war to peace transitions, are based on hard science. And in order to do that, you have to work with a clear, and I'll show you why in a second, you have to work with a clear distinction between war and peace, if you want to do that kind of hard science. Because it becomes very messy if you don't have a sharp distinction between war and peace. Secondly, generates this idea that essentially what we're dealing with is technical challenges, best practice. And thirdly, there's this idea that orthodox economics is scientific, and that's probably another lecture, but we can go there later. But I would argue all three of those things are deeply, deeply questionable. And I want to start by looking at the either-or of war and peace. Okay? Why do you need that for this particular version of hard science? Well, because if you want to do your statistics, you want to see patterns, things that affect post-conflict societies, peaceful societies versus war-torn societies, so on and so forth, you have to have clear distinctions, definitions, border posts, shibboleths. If you can't pronounce, you'll know what a shibboleth is, yeah? If you can't pronounce battle-death threshold properly, then you get put in one basket, and you're called war. But if you're below the annual threshold of 1,000 battle deaths per year, so you're not at war technically, you might be something else. Okay. So you need those clear distinctions. Once you've, the battle death or threshold, or you've signed a peace deal, a formal peace settlement, so on and so forth. But actually, this isn't really the reality of many countries around the world in recent history, or now. There are often spaces of peace within wars. There are elements of war in the midst of a technical peace. There is this condition, you might call it, that Paul Richards calls no war, no peace, which is a little tricky for statisticians to deal with, apart from anything else. Let me give you some examples. One, when did the American Civil War end? My goodness.
1864.
1865. Okay, I think. Get your smartphones out, check if I'm right or wrong. Anyway. So, but following that victory, right, 1865 in the American Civil War, huge defining event in American history, there was a fierce political conflict that was, in southern states of the US, very violent in parts of the South. And that was a conflict over something that was labelled Reconstruction. Reconstruction was a set of policies that the so-called radical Republicans set out long before neocons and so on and so forth. Right? It was very, very interesting set of ideas, very progressive in many, many ways. But the defeated interest groups in the South fought piecemeal in certain states more than others to reverse some of the progressive gains achieved by the North. Awkward things like making blacks and whites equal before the law, giving everybody the vote, so on and so forth. And they won those reversals in certain cases. Okay? So the post-conflict was not exactly peaceful. It was in fact very violent in many ways. After the war, the long, protracted, large-scale war, call it a civil war, call it whatever you want, in Angola, in southern Africa, you have, which ended in 2002 in a military victory, You have, in many ways, had the continuation of a war economy in the diamond, I was going to say diamond growing, in the diamond mining areas of the Lundas in northern Angola, so on and so forth. You have something called the fiscal police, very, very unpleasant to all sorts of people. And you do have multi-party elections and so on and so forth, but within the context of a phenomenon known as, and forgive me if there's any Lusophone people in here, partidarisation. Right? This is the domination of society by the party. Okay? This, in a sense, what is going on. Remember that, all right, Clausewitz, this famous saying, war is the continuation of peace by other means. Actually, in many cases, more recently, peace is the continuation of war by other, and sometimes the same means. El Salvador, higher level of violent deaths every year after the war than during the war. And so on. Other examples where peace settlements, formal peace settlements in some places that appear themselves to be continuations of conflict, naming no particular names. So there have been some efforts to kind of systematize, to come up with a topology. There are two. I'll just show you one of them because it is neat, and it's in a book called The Peace in Between. It says, look, when we look at post-conflict societies that are often very conflictual, we find different types. And here's the kind of key example, but not the only example of each time. So there's the victor's peace, post-Civil War Spain, a nasty place if you weren't a nationalist. The loser's peace that I've just told you about in the American Civil War, the so-called divided peace in Afghanistan, and the pacified peace, external pacification in West Africa and Liberia. So, at any rate, what I think is increasingly clear is that the war to peace transitions, the so-called post-conflict moment, isn't any such thing often. It's very conflictual, profoundly political, often very violent, and not just a sort of context for technical solutions. So the second part of this is to try and understand a bit more what the reconstruction bit involves. At one level it's obvious. Reconstruction is you break something, you put it back together again. A bridge, a health post, a school, housing in a certain area or whatever it might be, a road, etc. Secondly, though, you don't necessarily put a society back together again the way it was before the conflict. Otherwise you might get the same conflict happening again. So you have in peace deals things like, I don't know, a provision in the Chapultepec Accords in 1992 in El Salvador for granting land to ex-combatants on both sides and so on, to try and address some of the grievances both before and during the war. So there's some element often of transformation within reconstruction. But thirdly, that can be a slightly more, for good and ill, or ill, it might be a slightly more kind of power-driven, aggressive thing. So that transformation is likely to reflect the political settlement that emerges after a war. And that, by that I mean, both the structure of the kind of coalition that sustains post-war stability, if there is such stability. It might just be the victor in a victor's peace, but it might be in a negotiated settlement, a more complex coalition. But you also have to see nowadays, because no conflict is an island, every conflict is globalized in some way or other, or usually more than one way, that political settlement, that coalition, is internationalized. Okay. So just to give you two ideas of this kind of, the idea of where reconstruction, maybe reconstruction in the image of the victor, the self-image of the victor. One is, again, the American Civil War. And if I can find it, I do love this. But, all right. So this guy, Thaddeus Stevens, was one of the architects of Reconstruction. And look how kind of fierce and the opposite of mealy-mouthed he was in kind of explaining what had to be done in southern states in the USA. The whole idea is if we're going to reconstruct, we have to do it by treating Southerners, right, as a conquered people. No wonder it generated a bit of conflict in the South. But you might argue, and here's where I'd be a bit loose and provocative, that Something similar is happening when liberal market democracy is strongly encouraged upon societies emerging from violent conflict through a range of technical conditionalities behind aid and so on and so forth. Okay? The argument, as I mentioned earlier, that this is a moment when you can achieve very, very rapid change because of institutional vacuums, so on and so forth. So from that perspective, you might say that the victors of many recent violent conflicts are actually international interests. Not exclusively, some domestic interests too. And that's where I want to try and bring in, I'm not quite sure I'm bringing this in the right way, but the difference behind the way in which powerful international forces interact with developing countries, lower-income countries, nowadays from what we used to do historically. And to do this, I have to lean on my wonderful friend Alice Amsden, who died less than a year ago, who was a brilliant American economist. And she used to talk about the First American Empire and the Second American Empire. The First American Empire began after the end of the the Second World War. Sorry. And during the First American Empire, so long as you were on the right side and you weren't raving commies, you got lots of aid, but essentially you had what we nowadays in the aid world called, you had lots of policy space. There was room for experiment with institutions and policies and so on and so forth. You could violate the precepts of textbook economics and comparative advantage, so on and so forth. The motto, Alice used to say, of the First American Empire was, you do it your way. As long as you're on side, broadly, just do it your way. We won't worry too much. It enabled the French, after World War II, French planners, the Monet and so on and so forth, to be brilliant in the way they manipulated American aid behind essentially a kind of raft of planning mechanisms and industrial policies that were very, very effective, arguably. And it was very important in Korea too. However, the First American Empire came to an end. When? Anybody remember? When
did the Cold War?
Hmm?
End of the Cold War?
Earlier. A little earlier. 1979, 1980. Hike in interest rates, so on and so forth. A shift, ideologically, etc. And her argument is that in the Second American Empire, the motto was not you do it your way, you do it my way. So there was a much more powerful commitment to what then became known as the Washington Consensus and so on and so forth. Okay. So, do you know what? I'm talking far too slowly, and I was going to talk a little bit about technique, best practice and ideology, but I think that I might skip that a little bit. I will. We can come back to it if we want. Well, I might do it very, very quickly. I want to kind of put in your heads the idea, or provoke, or annoy you by suggesting that there are a set of rhetorical commonplaces, things we take as common sense to do with liberal market democracy, that get turned into best practice through TA, technical assistance programs and so on and so forth, that are in fact arguably ideological. Not just that they're not objective science and they're just, but they're in fact a set of ideas and values, but that they often mystify the reality. They divert attention from interests, locally and internationally and so on and so forth. And I think that that best practice thing, can I tell us a Dominican story? Can I do that? Have I got time for that? And this is my favourite little anecdote about the kind of, one-size-fits-all best practice thing is when I was on a team doing a European Commission country strategy evaluation for Mozambique post-war. And I wasn't the team leader, and I was in Maputo, and I went to the airport to meet the team leader, Peruvian economist, who was landing from elsewhere. And so I took him into town to show him around, and I said, do you know much about Mozambique? The answer? No, but it doesn't matter because I've got the Dominican model. been to the Dominican Republic, and so on and so forth. So it doesn't matter, it's the same, you know, low income, poor people, whatever. Do the same thing there. You don't have to worry too much about context, blah, blah, blah. But these are things, you know, the content of the Dominican model, whatever it was, these things, they do circulate as rhetorical commonplaces that kind of sort of shape what we think is acceptable and not acceptable in many ways. They are part of the sort of organizing principles of the narratives that I think we often tell. And these include things like the idea, I'd like to spend more time on, but I probably won't. War is development in reverse. Yeah, of course. Obviously. Development is conflict prevention. Yeah, often people, that's a good idea. That makes a certain kind of sense to many people. You can't have security without development, but you can't have development without security. Security development nexus. What do you do with that? These are all things that kind of shape what's going on in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Libya, Somalia, Sierra Leone, elsewhere, so on and so forth. But I'm not going to tell you about US counterterrorism, counterinsurgency manuals, which actually kind of materialize quite a lot of this, because it'll take me a bit of time. I want to move on and focus a little bit more on this content of the liberal peace thesis in particular, right? Before explaining some of its historical antecedents. So within the liberal peace thesis, it's often made manifest in something people give different labels and names to, but one of the most polite is the triple transition. Another one is bargain basement imperialism, but I think this works better. Right? And another one is the great post-conflict makeover fantasy. Right? But this is just nice and clear. This is Marina Rothway's distinction. Saying, look, what countries are strongly encouraged to go through? Iraq, Mozambique, Sierra Leone, etc., etc. Is a security transition, a political transition, and a socio-economic transition. What lies behind each of these can be boiled down to the following statement. Our ideas about good governance and liberal market democracy. That's simple. So security transition is not just DDR, disarmament, demobilization, reintegration. It's about reforming the institutions of security along the lines of transparency and accountability, anti-corruption, etc., etc. And these are brilliant, lovely, lovely things. Very, very desirable on their own, in theory. They are good things, but do all good things go together? Second, the political transition, what's been prioritized for many years, debates about its sequencing, is the emphasis on multi-party elections as the appropriate way to undergo political transition. And thirdly, the socio-economic transition, at the heart of which is essentially a set of deregulations and market liberalization policies. For good or ill, that is what defines most of those things. Whether they actually work when they meet particular contexts and when they emerge from the fact that donors argue with each other and so have different priorities is a different story. But they're part of the kind of original oral tradition, if you like, that helps define what's acceptable practice and what we then work our way from towards specific policies. Okay. Now, and by the way, if you have ideas about kind of development through liberal markets, and you have ideas about good governance, there is a very powerful all good things go together here idea that good governance is a precursor for and a precondition for development. That's a strong idea. I'm sure many of you are familiar with it. It's wrong, but it's a powerful idea. Has Mushtaq been here? Yeah? Okay.
Oh, yeah, it was.
Yeah. Anyway, so one way in seeing something about thinking through some of these ideas is to see them in their historical context. And there are two really interesting and slightly different starting point historical developments in the history of thought behind what we now call the liberal interpretation of war. All war is exclusively negative in all its consequences, and the liberal peace thesis. Good governance, democratization, market liberalization. The first goes back to philosophers like Kant and some of the early French economists and so on and so forth, and then was later reinforced by the kind of, in many ways, wonderful champions of free trade like Richard Cobden and Tom Paine and so on and so forth. But the idea here was, look, naturally, we're all very, very lovely. We're peaceable folk. Right? We're prevented from being that. We keep getting stuck and called up to fight in wars because of two things. Two kinds of narrow social organisation. Two kinds of monopoly, if you like, oligopoly. One is political, and that's ruled by non-competitive, non-elected, hereditary warrior classes and monarchies. So you have narrow groups of warrior class with kings and queens, and what they do is war. That's all they enjoy. That's their kind of raison d'etre. And the other is economic. The problem is that alongside those, the warrior class and the kings and so on and so forth, is a set of narrow vested interests controlling markets within countries and controlling international trade through mercantilist policies and so on and so forth. And they argued, some of these early economists and philosophers like Kant, that if you could change these things, you would get perpetual peace. And sort of cutting corners a little bit, this is where you end up with the argument that if you democratize, you open up polities, you liberalize politics, and if you liberalize markets, you have much more, you reduce the barriers to entry in markets, competitive markets, so on and so forth, you will have peace forever. That's an amazing thing. What an incredibly powerful set of ideas. And it was radical and progressive. Its historical context, this was sort of brave stuff, challenging established powers and interests and so on and so forth. And you can combine that with a kind of another feature of that tradition that evolved over time, which, as I've said, was this idea that all war is everywhere negative in all its consequences. And you end up in our language of today. Democratization, market liberalization, and the idea that war, as the World Bank put it in 2003, is development in reverse. War retards development, sends it into reverse gear. Development retards war, okay, and it's conflict prevention. So, I said there were two historical threads behind contemporary liberal peace thinking. The other is really interesting, and this is told in one of my favourite books by Albert Hirschman, called The Passions and the Interests. And the subtitle is Political Arguments for Capitalism Before Its Triumph. So what he's talking about, I suppose, 17th, 18th century, is the way in which Montesquieu, among others, what they did was they didn't start from the assumption we're all peaceful and lovely and perfect. They started from the assumption that we're pretty bad in many ways. We're ruled by passions, naughty impulses. Okay? But it was an intriguing set of innovations in the history of thought. The first was to say, there's another subdivision of the passions that we'll call them something else. They're called interests. Okay? We think that making interests, profiting things are immoral and so on and so forth, but they're not quite as bad as chopping people's heads off and stabbing them and so on and so forth. So we'll call them something different. We'll call them interests, and then you assign values to the passions and the interests. And you say, the passions are really bad and the interests are lesser evils. And the next innovation, which is really extraordinary, is to deploy the lesser interests against the greater passions. Okay? So you say, if we can encourage people to concentrate on the interests, the bad but bearable stuff, making money, so on and so forth, they'll start forgetting about the really bad stuff. It'll divert their attention away from the passions. And you can convert that again into the idea that the development of capitalism, development more broadly in economic activity, may be something that prevents violence, conflict, and war. And it's an amazing. So you get Adam Smith talking about the English countryside, for example, the great Adam Smith. saying the English countryside was a place of just appalling viciousness and mess and all these feudal lords fighting each other and so on and so forth. Until you introduced manufactures and trade. And then they started being really, that's all they started caring about, was who had the shiniest boots and smartest velvet jacket or whatever it might be, the nicest hat. And then everything you said turned peaceable in the countryside. Over-egging it a little bit. You found that idea a lot. You found it one of the traditions, one place where you found it was in the early, not the later, but the early works of Keynes, that other great, great economist. Again, saying, early 20th century, if you channel people's activities into economic activity, you will avoid war. Now, the extraordinary thing for me about this story, told by Albert Hirschman, is he wrote it in the mid-70s, I think, and he said, look, I don't really know why you should be reading my book, because this is just a historical curiosity. How funny that people used to think that capitalist development was conflict prevention. How hilarious. What a strange historical oddity. And yet, that's in the mid-70s. By the mid-90s and to the 2000s, that's what we all think. That's what we're led to believe. It is now a rhetorical commonplace. It is a kind of common sense assumption. So that's really interesting to see how these ideas have gone in and out of fashion. However, if I've got time, what I want to do now, against that background, is to say, is firstly to say why I think things go wrong when you get quite close to implementing the liberal peace, and to say what I think policymakers, advisors, etc., don't confront enough in these contexts of war to peace transition. That's mainly what I want to do before, and then I'll finish. So to be concise and very, very crude and oversimplistic, I think the assumptions that I've been discussing, as they affect what happens in Afghanistan and Mozambique, Iraq, so on and so forth, represent a serious misunderstanding of economic development and how it comes about. And they radically oversimplify, if not get badly wrong, the relationship between development and violence and conflict. Okay? So, let's start with the violence bit. There's this really interesting insight I think is right from Douglas North, the economic historian, which is essentially that all societies, all of them, face a violence problem. They just manage it in different ways. So the nice Norwegians manage it one way, the Somalis manage it another way, the Americans another, etc., etc. But in the UK or in Sweden or Norway or whatever, we still have a violence problem. It's just contained, it's managed, okay? So, how? How do states that aren't at war, constantly beset by violence, how do they do it? How do they control this? And for Douglas North, there's like a twofold thing going on. Firstly, a state has to be able to make a credible threat, a believable threat, to those interest groups capable of taking up arms and threatening the state with violence, that when I say put down your arms, A, I mean it, and I'm going to do something about it, but B, you needn't worry because your competitor elite interests over there, they're also going to lay down their arms because I'm also going to tell them they have to, and if they don't, I'll come after them. The state has to be able to make it credible. How do you do that? You need a monopoly of force. You've got to achieve one, which is quite a challenge. But that's the stick. There's also a carrot, which is the way you do it, is you create a political settlement that draws together otherwise violent, nasty rival interest groups. And you do that by offering opportunities for rent. Non-competitive, non-market profits, if you like. So you've got to give them access to that as a sort of incentive. Now, So there's two sides to this. There's a kind of coercive story and there's a rent story. And note that neither of those really quite look like good governance and liberal market development. You know, market liberalisation is supposed to get rid of opportunities for rent and rent seeking and so on and so forth. So that's Douglas North, very mainstream in many, many ways, making that argument. You then get the interesting argument from the Crisis States Research Centre at the LSE, saying that, look, what's interesting to look at if you look at different places within Africa, for example, is that you will find that in some of those, you have stable political settlements. There is stability. But if that's a good thing, it doesn't necessarily go with the other good thing, which is development. So you can have stability, you know, rent and coercion and so on and so forth, but it's stuck. There's no structural change, no industrialization, no real increases in productivity in agriculture, no real development. So it's not clear here that all good things do go together. And you take it a step further and you end up reading Antonio Giustozzi's book, lovely book, please read it, called The Art of Coercion. And he does a huge sweep. He's a man who knows unbelievable amount about the Taliban and Afghanistan and stuff. But he stepped out and he did this big sweep. And Antonio's argument is that at the heart of what we like to think of as state building, state formation, is this art of coercion. And it involves two steps. One, to borrow Marx's phrase about capital and economics, there's a primitive accumulation of the monopoly of force. What does that mean? In simple words, what that means is, in order to achieve it in the first place, you have to be really foul. It's vicious, it's brutal, historically, almost everywhere. Once you've got it, you then face a very, very difficult challenge of maintaining your monopoly of violence and trying to achieve some sort of legitimacy for it and so on and so forth. And again, his argument is essentially that neither of those things, historically anywhere, has been achieved through accountability, transparency, democracy, good governance. Okay? These are awkward paradoxes of bringing about change. However, let's focus on the incentive bit of that for a moment. The incentive bit, remember, was to do with rent, economic opportunities, so on and so forth. And I'm not convinced that the liberal piece, the triple transition thing as applied, when it has been, has done a brilliant job on that side either. Let me try and talk through three examples to briefly throw some light on my argument here. One is Mozambique, and it's a classic success story. It hasn't been hugely violent since the end of the war at all. It's had a series of multi-party elections, albeit with fewer and fewer people turning out to vote, and albeit the same party winning every time. It's a one-party democracy, essentially, increasingly. And in 20 years, we're just getting now rumours that the former rebel, Afonso Dhlakama, has gone back to the Gorongosa in the countryside and saying he's threatening to go back to war. He won't, but nonetheless, it means something. Now, interestingly, this is a country that did everything it was asked to. Highly aid-dependent. Okay? It rolled over and did everything it was told. Nothing, really. There's been fast growth. There's even been rapid growth. But the level of extreme poverty, it's the same. Hasn't basically changed. There was a recent World Bank paper about rural poverty and agriculture in Mozambique saying in 30 years or more, nothing essentially has changed. That's devastating. That's terrible. Think of the resources that have been thrown at this change. There's been, if anything, now this takes more explaining, so I'm not going to do it. I'm just going to talk about like what you would find out through research that a student of ours did on the manufacturing sector in Mozambique, so on and so forth. There has essentially been anti-development structural change. What do I mean by that? By that I mean there's been a deindustrialization, an emptying out of capabilities for technical innovation, industrial processes, and so on and so forth within Mozambique. One of the key parts of the transition from war to peace in Mozambique was the largest privatization program in Africa, deemed a massive success in terms of the number of enterprises that were sold off. And the problem for me, with that ideology, it was not that you shouldn't necessarily do privatization, but that it represented ideology getting the better of pragmatism. It was privatization for the sake of it. In a context where there was no effective regulator, no regulation of privatized enterprises, there was rapid capital account liberalization and very, very poor bank management. So what happened was a lot of fairly corrupt deals, a lot of asset stripping, capital flight, so on and so forth, and a big strain on public finance because it had to deal with a lot of bad debts that had been, accumulated in order to buy these enterprises and so on and so forth, or stakes in them. So, interestingly, that would take me into what I think is more kind of the reality, the reality of war to peace transitions, which is a kind of what I call not money laundering but war laundering. That privatization process in many ways enabled people who through military and party links had accumulated assets and land during the war, to launder those war-gotten gains into legitimate peacetime activity. Maybe that's a good thing, but it's only if it's producing the employment, the productivity, the structural change, etc., etc. It's certainly part of the political settlement. So, other things happen similarly elsewhere. In Afghanistan, Aspi Serke, amongst others, would argue there's been a massive attempt at social engineering that completely denies a whole long history of trying to do this again and again and again as outsiders, and failing again and again and again, partly because we fail to actually think where we are. And one of those examples would be judicial reform. She wrote an interesting paper about the way in which judicial reform was everything about international best practice. A bunch of Italian lawyers coming in and advising on this best practice. No consultation. And it, not surprisingly, didn't quite, it didn't go down that well politically. But to kind of move on to Iraq, which often people say, well, Iraq was different. In many ways, Iraq was the apogee of this. Okay? Not a kind of mad outlier. What the CPA tried to achieve was exactly a kind of apogee of neoliberal reforms at great pace. And again, it was ideology trumping pragmatism. So we had, have I got time to go on for 5-10 minutes? Can I do that? So it started already early on because the State Department had developed some ideas about what might happen after an invasion and an occupation of Iraq. And that was a document worked on with Iraqi exiles, the Future of Iraq project. And there's an interesting story about the way in which the Defense Department in the States just threw that in the bin, weren't interested. Okay, and when the State Department sent 2 Middle East experts, Rumsfeld summarily dismissed them. Knowledge, not particularly useful here. Okay? So the government, the CPA then met years of accumulated problems in Iraq. Right? State-run, badly state-run, war-affected economy, affected by sanctions, so on and so forth, with a simple gung-ho faith in sweeping liberalization. So there was an eager plan to privatize about 190 state-owned enterprises in Iraq, employing up to 650,000 people. Sell them, privatize them. Eventually, the CPA had to kind of abandon it, had to shelve that plan. But it hadn't come up with an alternative, how you restructure existing state-owned enterprises. It had managed to create massive political opposition to that plan. Right? And coupled with rapid de-Baathification, what that meant was that even those state-owned enterprises that may have some comparative advantage in reconstruction, cement producers, for example, they couldn't take part. They'd lost all the people who knew how to work these things. Right? This is the direct opposite of how the Allies dealt with Germany post-World War II. Pragmatic denazification, huge amounts of training programs, retraining programs, all built on 3 years of planning at a very operational level beforehand about what they would do if they won the war. Okay? Radically the opposite of what's happened. I could go on and on about Iraq, and I mean, you know, there was a joint assessment of Iraq's needs after 2003 by the UN and the World Bank, and they judged that it would be necessary to maintain subsidized inputs to agriculture if they wanted to maintain levels of production and avoid a complete collapse of production and massive unemployment. And to put it as an ICG report did at the time, the CPA did not implement this recommendation. Again, you know, the pragmatic thing to do, your textbook might tell you, shouldn't have these subsidies. They distort market prices. The bank and the UN agencies were saying, hey, you need them. For God's sake, be pragmatic. No, get rid of them. Ideology trumping pragmatism. So, where am I going to end? I'm going to move beyond the kind of the reality of war to peace transitions, in which economics is more often the continuation of violence by other means, to say that I'm not the only person. There are lots of people who have critiques of the standard issue, particularly the economic reforms in war to peace transitions, who argue that they tend to produce very, very narrow development. So in Mozambique you've got growth, but inequality is very, very extreme, and poverty not really reduced, for example, and many other cases too. You have Valpy Fitzgerald, Tilman Brooke arguing in Nicaragua and Mozambique. In both cases, the donors and the policymakers completely ignored production. Okay? You have Del Castillo making a similar critique of exclusive development program in East Timor after independence there, so on and so forth. So, where that takes me is to try and finish, if I can still grab your attention for a minute, by saying that I think there's a very simple way of summing up what should be the primary challenges for governments, international organizations, NGOs, World Bank, etc., in war to peace transitions from an economic point of view and political. And they are these: how to pay for the peace, how to produce the peace, and how to work for peace. Those are the questions. How to pay for the peace, just very briefly. What is a state? A state essentially is a taxman and a spender. Right? The state is about taxation, fundamentally, and always has been. Now, in many cases, like Afghanistan and so on and so forth, there's quite a lot of literature increasingly now showing that large foreign-supported war to peace transitions they kind of crowd out domestic revenue mobilization efforts, as well as distorting market prices locally, and as well as the fact that many of those internationals don't pay taxes they earn whilst they're helping countries recover from war and so on and so forth. So there's a massive problem here, and you end up with states like Afghanistan, which are frankly not fiscally viable states. Afghanistan is not going to have state building unless it has a long-term strategy for raising revenue domestically and other sources of resource mobilization. Otherwise, apart from anything else, it's never going to have any independence. Keynes, my great hero Keynes, towards the end of, I get this because he wrote a book called How to Pay for the War, so How to Pay for Peace. Towards the end of the Second World War, and they paid for the war and so on and so forth, his concerns were about the post-war order. And one of the beautiful things about the way Keynes thought was he always thought, how can I come up with an economic policy recommendation that makes sense, that solves the economic problem and maybe the political war problem, but at the same time is distributionally progressive. And the other thing he was interested in post-World War II was how could countries like the UK balance independence with their necessary interdependence with the USA and others? Well, you want the balance. Now, in Afghanistan, you just don't have that unless there's some domestic revenue foundation. And there are lots more things we can say about what tax policy, revenue policy needs to do post-war, but it would take us too long. But the point is that taxation and tax policy are about efficiency, but they're also political. They're not just technical. It takes us back to where I started. Who pays what taxes, where the burden of taxation falls, is profoundly political in every country, but especially in these contexts. But taxation and spending, right, so fiscal policy overall, is also very, very important to producing development structural change. Now, so fiscal policy is going to be important not just for how to pay for the peace and wean yourself off donor funds, but also how to generate development and production. At the same time, you can't have a fiscal foundation and revenue base over the long run unless you've got a productive base. What are you taxing? You can't only tax trade forever, and so on and so forth, and impose VAT, general sales tax, so on and so forth. Over the long run, you need some kind of productive base, right, to build a viable state. And the third connected thing is production is expanded production. How much, what percentage of resources, government budgets, donor money, war to peace countries and post-conflict goes to agriculture? Shockingly little on average. Shockingly little. What goes to industrial policy? Even less. Okay? But how else are you also going to employ people? And we don't need to make, I think it's questionable, I think it's a problem area for me. I don't think we have good enough data for this. I'm not sure we need to make a simplistic assumption that unemployment causes war or violence or something like that. But we still know that in its own terms, unemployment and underemployment in low productivity activities is a problem in and of itself for people and their livelihoods and their welfare. But it probably is a political problem too, and certainly in some countries. So if you really want to achieve stability in an elite bargain and peace and development at the same time, I think the way to do it, rather than focusing on ideals of market liberalization, deregulation, state-of-the-art stock markets, capital account liberalization, comparative advantage, so on and so forth, you start from the reality of these pragmatic challenges and you work out from there what are the policies that work in particular contexts, and you're going to stop that. Something like that?